You're staring at a row of small marks, curves, lines, little dots. And without any effort at all, those marks are pouring thoughts straight into your mind. Ideas that began inside another person's head are now assembling themselves inside yours. You call this reading. Have you ever stopped to notice how impossible that should be? For almost the entire story of your species, it was. Humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Writing has existed for barely 5,000. That means for more than 98% of human history, not one single person on Earth could do the thing your eyes are doing right now. Think about what that world was like. Every fact a human knew lived in exactly one place, a skull. When that person died, everything they had learned died with them. A recipe, a route across the desert, the name of a grandmother, the location of the best fishing spot. All of it gone, unless someone had memorized it and passed it on before the end. A promise existed only as long as two people remembered it. A debt was real only if both sides agreed it was. There was no way to reach across a distance without walking there yourself. There was no way to speak to the future at all. So how did that change? How did a species that could only ever talk learn to make its thoughts sit still? To find out, you have to go to a flat, hot stretch of land between two rivers. The rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. The land is called Mesopotamia, which is simply an old Greek word meaning between the rivers. Today you would call it Iraq. 5,000 years ago, you would have called it the edge of the known world. Here, cities were being born for the first time. The biggest was a place called Uruk. And Uruk had a problem. It had become huge, tens of thousands of people, temples that owned enormous herds of animals and vast stores of grain, workers who had to be paid in barley and beer, taxes that had to be collected. And here's the quiet crisis at the center of civilization. No human brain could hold all of it. You cannot remember who owes what to whom when the who is 30,000 people. You cannot track 10,000 sheep in your head. The city had outgrown memory itself. And this is where an archaeologist named Denise Schmant-Besserat enters the story. In the 1970s and 80s, she spent years studying thousands of tiny clay objects that had been dug up all across the ancient Middle East. Little cones, little spheres, little discs and cylinders. For decades, no one knew what they were. They were dismissed as toys or game pieces or junk. Schmant-Besserat noticed something. These small clay shapes went back nearly 10,000 years, long before any writing. And they came in standardized forms that repeated everywhere. Her idea was simple and enormous. They were an accounting system. One little cone might mean one small measure of grain. One sphere, a larger measure. A disc shaped like an animal, one sheep. To count your goods, you kept a matching set of these tokens in a pouch. You did not need to read, you just needed to match. 10 sheep tokens. This was humanity keeping records without yet knowing how to write. But there was still a flaw. Tokens could be lost. Tokens could be swapped. If you sent goods across the city with a runner, what stopped him from quietly slipping a token into his own pocket? So they invented a container, a hollow ball of wet clay. You sealed your tokens inside it, and the clay dried hard, and now the count could not be tampered with. Archaeologists call these sealed clay balls bully. A single word, bullei, meaning the little sealed spheres that locked a transaction inside. But this created a new, almost comic problem. Once the clay hardened, you could no longer see what was inside without smashing the whole thing open. You had built a record you could not read. So someone in some accounting room in Uruk had a very small idea that would change everything about your life. Before sealing the ball, they pressed each token into the soft outer surface, leaving its shape stamped on the outside. Now you could see, right there on the shell, the count of what was locked within. And then came the leap. Someone looked at that ball, covered in the marks of the tokens, and realized the tokens inside had become completely unnecessary. Why keep the objects at all? The marks on the outside were the record. You did not need the sheep-shaped token. You only needed the mark that meant sheep. So they flattened the ball into a tablet, and they pressed the signs directly into the clay. That was it. That was writing being born, not as poetry, not as prophecy, but as a better filing cabinet. The tool they used was a cut reed, a stylus pressed into wet clay, A reed pushed into soft clay does not make a smooth line. It makes a little wedge, a tiny triangular dent. And from those wedges came the name of the world's first writing system, cuneiform. The word comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, wedge writing. Now, is there proof of what these first writers were actually writing about? There is, and it is the strangest, most human part of the whole story. The Sumerologist Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent his life reading these tablets, titled his famous book, History Begins at Sumer, because this is where the written record of humanity truly starts. And when scholars translated the very oldest tablets from Uruk, dating to around 3300 BCE, they did not find hymns. They did not find kings boasting of victories. They did not find love. They found receipts, lists of barley, counts of sheep and goats, rations of beer handed out to workers, amounts of grain owed to the temple. The oldest writing on earth is bookkeeping. It is the paperwork of a warehouse. And here's the detail that will stay with you. On one of these ancient accounting tablets, alongside a record of barley measured out over 3 years, there is a single sign that scholars read as a name. Kushim. It may be a title. It may be a person. But if it is a person, then Kushim is very possibly the oldest recorded name in all of human history. The first human being whose name we can still read, thousands of years after their death. And that person was an accountant, not a king, not a hero, not a poet. Before anyone thought to write down a story or a god or a law, a nameless clerk in a temple wrote down how much beer they had signed for. The first voice to reach across 5,000 years of silence is the voice of someone doing their inventory. Sit with how backwards that feels. You probably imagine writing beginning with something grand, a carving of a prayer, a message to the gods. Instead, it began with the ancient equivalent of a spreadsheet. But something remarkable happened next, and it is the reason you can read this at all. At first, these marks could only show things. A picture of an ox meant an ox. A picture of grain meant grain. You cannot draw a picture of a name or a verb or the word yesterday. So the scribes discovered a trick that historians of language call the rebus principle. It works like sound. Imagine drawing a picture of an eye, a picture of a saw, and a picture of the sea to write, I saw the sea. You are no longer drawing meaning. You are drawing sound. The Sumerians did exactly this, using the picture of a thing to stand for the sound of its name, and suddenly writing could capture anything a mouth could say. Names, laws, stories, grief, everything. The accountant's tool had quietly become the container for the entire human soul. And once that happened, it never stopped. Cuneiform spread across the ancient world for 3,000 years. And writing was invented again, independently, by people who had never heard of Sumer, the Egyptians with their hieroglyphs, the Chinese with marks carved on oracle bones, the Maya in the forests of the Americas. Humanity kept arriving at the same impossible idea from different directions, because every civilization eventually hits the same wall Uruk hit. The moment you grow past what one mind can hold, you must invent a way to think outside your own head. So look back down at the marks in front of you, that receipt crumpled in your pocket, the text message that lit up your phone this morning, the list you scribbled of things to buy. Notice what they are. They are accounts and records and reminders and names. 5,000 years later, an enormous share of everything ever written is still doing the exact job Kushim was doing, keeping track, so that memory does not have to. Every time you check a number on a screen, you are using a temple accountant's invention. Every time you read a word, you are pulling a thought out of another mind across space and time, something no creature on this planet could do before a clerk in Uruk pressed a reed into clay. You are staring at a row of small marks, and through them, 5,000 years of the dead are speaking to you, and will keep speaking, long after you are gone.